Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in for the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So Mitch the Mad Lad is back today with a new and spicy build, and it's up to you to decide if this deck is genius or completely crazy. This time I decide to challenge myself with a commander that basically sees no play at all. I mean, this commander currently on EDH Rec has just 7 decks to its name. And that commander is of course the one and only Myojin of Seeing Winds. I was actually fascinated with this card quite a long time ago because it did a lot of work in my Joda Archmage Eternal deck, which I believe was only my second deck tech of all time. Regardless, its effectiveness in the 99 of a deck like that one is just slightly different than the potential effectiveness of it as a commander. Or should I say, its perceived potential effectiveness. It's only a 3/3 spirit, and it costs 7 blue, so yeah, that's 10 mana for a 3/3. It has Myojin of Seeing Winds comes into play with a Divinity counter on it if you played it from your hand. Myojin of Seeing Winds is indestructible as long as it has a Divinity counter on it. And remove a Divinity counter from Myojin of Seeing Winds, draw a card for each permanent you control. So yeah, that Divinity counter can be very effective of course. The only problem is, we don't get the Divinity counter when we cast this commander from the command zone. So obviously, to start things off, we're basically paying 10 mana for a 3/3 that does absolutely nothing. So that's exactly why this commander sees basically no play. But I'm here to tell you that with the right build and with the right workarounds, we can make this commander incredibly impactful and it can win the game out of absolutely nowhere. Again, with a Divinity counter, or should I say Divinity counters, you can draw an absurd amount of cards. So this commander that actually doesn't look like it should work as a commander can be incredibly impactful and can really come out of nowhere to win. That being said, we need a lot of setup and again the right build to make this commander work. So let's start things off by talking about the absurd amount of ramp that we're going to be running for this 10 mana commander. First up at 1 mana, obviously we can utilize a mana rock like Soul Ring, which costs 1 and taps for 2, so yeah, it's incredibly efficient and pretty much broken in Commander. But we're also going to utilize another 1 mana rock that takes a lot more work but can be incredibly impactful once we're set up with Pyramid of the Pantheon. It has by paying 2 and tapping it, you add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool and you put a brick counter on Pyramid of the Pantheon. And then you can tap it to add 3 mana of any one color to your mana pool, but only if it's got 3 or more brick counters on it. Essentially, this starts off as an inefficient mana filter, but then as soon as you filter 3 times, it can tap for 3. If we get this down early, we can easily build that up, and this can help us a lot later on in the game. Next up, we've got some 2 mana rocks that tap for 1 with Mind Stone, Prismatic Lens, and Fractured Power Stone. I've said this in many episodes before, but I'll say it again. When it comes to mana ramp, I want at least half the mana back that I put into something. And typically, ramping on turn 2 is very important, so these can be fantastic. Mind Stone has some extra utility where we can pay 1 to tap and sacrifice it to draw a card, and Prismatic Lens can filter our mana, though that's probably not necessary at all for this monocolor deck. Next up, we've got some more 2 mana rocks with Liquid Metal Torque, Ebony Fly, and Sky Diamond. Liquid Metal Torque taps for a colorless, and it can tap to make target non-land permanent artifact additional to other types until end of turn, which can help out in some kind of strange circumstances, but really that's not why it's in this deck. And then Ebony Fly is a new mana rock that costs 2, enters the battlefield tapped and taps for colorless, and it can also turn into a fly essentially, that when it attacks gives something else flying, but that's not really why it's in this deck. It's a mana rock that costs 2 and taps for 1. So in a similar way, there's Sky Diamond, which costs 2, enters the battlefield tapped and taps for a blue, and again, when it comes to a monocolor deck like this one, it doesn't really matter to us all that much if it's blue or colorless. And then next up for our 3 mana rocks, we've got Worn Power Stone, Coalition Relic, and Skyclave Relic. Worn Power Stone enters the battlefield tapped and it taps for colorless. So though this enters the battlefield tapped, it is a very efficient mana rock that gives us more than half the amount of mana back that we put into it. And then Coalition Relic can also give us 2 mana, but it works a bit differently. We can tap it to add 1 mana of any color, or we can tap to put a charge counter on it. And at the beginning of our pre-combat main phase, remove all charge counters from it and add 1 mana of any color for each charge counter moved this way. So basically with this, we can kind of store a mana with that charge counter on it, and yeah, just basically get 2 mana in a turn with this by tapping it for a mana in that next turn. But also, we do have ways to get more charge counters on this, though we'll talk about those ways here in a bit. Regardless, next up there's Skyclave Relic, which is an indestructible artifact that taps for 1 mana of any color, but it's also got Kicker 3. And when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, we create 2 tap tokens that are copies of Skyclave Relic. So if we need this early, we can put it down early, but more likely we're going to want to hold on to it until later in the game when we can actually kick it. Because essentially then we're paying 6 mana for 3 mana rocks that each tap for 1. And then at 4 mana we've got Hedron Archive, Sisay's Ring, or Golem's Eye. Each of them essentially do the exact same thing. They cost 4 and they tap for 2. On top of that though, Hedron Archive has pay 2 and tap and sacrifice it to draw 2 cards. And then next up we've got Firemine Vessel, Empowered Auto Generator, and Overflowing Chalice. Firemine Vessel comes into play tapped, and we can tap to add 2 mana of different colors, which again, doesn't really matter all that much because we're a monocolored deck and we will just use whatever mana we can generate. And speaking of mana generation, Empowered Auto Generator can be fantastic in this deck. It enters the battlefield tapped, and we can tap to put a charge counter on it and add X mana of any one color, where X the number of charge counters on Empowered Auto Generator. So basically this can just keep building more and more throughout the game, and again, like I mentioned earlier, we've got ways to actually add more counters onto this as well. And speaking of adding more counters onto something, there's Everflowing Chalice. It's an artifact that doesn't cost anything, but it's got multi-kicker too. It's going to enter the battlefield with a charge counter on it for each time it was kicked, and we can tap it to add colorless for each charge counter on it. So this is a variable mana rock that we can cast whenever it works best for us. If we need to ramp early, we can put this down for 2 mana, and then it can tap for 1. But more likely, we're going to want to build up our resources so it can tap for a ton. And again, we'll get to those ways to add even more counters here in a bit. And then the final mana rock that I'm going to talk about is Dreamstone Hedron. It's an artifact for 6 and it taps for 3, so again, half the amount of mana that we put into it, and on top of that, it's got pay 3 and tap and sacrifice it, draw 3 cards. So it's got some additional utility to it, and actually we can utilize that utility later on in the game when we're set up to even help us win the game in some scenarios. Regardless, 2 other cards that we are going to be running that can really help us with mana are Dramatic Reversal and High Tide. Dramatic Reversal is an instant that lets us untap all non-land permanents we control. So essentially for this deck's purposes, hey, just untap all of your mana rocks and you get even more mana now. This can come in really handy, especially when we're going off with our commander, and we'll talk about exactly how we do that here in a bit. Finally, there's High Tide, which is an instant for a blue that says, until end of turn, whenever a player taps an island for mana, that player adds blue to their mana pool. Basically, this doubles up the effectiveness of our islands, which, yeah, can really help us out with this kind of a deck. We're looking to generate an absurd amount of mana in 1 turn. Again, our commander costs 10 mana, and we're going to want even more than that because, well, let's talk about that here in the next tactic. Because our commander doesn't get the divinity counter unless we cast it from our hand, we're going to have to spend that 10 mana to get it in play, and then we need something else to actually bounce it back to our hand. So we're going to be running some cheap bounce spells like String of Disappearances, Seal of Removal, and Aether Spellbomb. String of Disappearances is an instant for a blue that says, return target creature to its owner's hand, then that creature's controller may pay blue. If the player does, they may copy the spell and choose a new target for the copy. So obviously if we get our Myojin out in play and we cast this, well, we're going to bounce it back to our hand, which is exactly what we want. And since we targeted our own creature, since we're that creature's controller, we can pay blue if we've got that extra blue to bounce something else as well. And then maybe that player bounces something else. So yeah, this can actually help us out in multiple ways. A very effective bounce spell in this deck though is Seal of Removal. It's an enchantment for a blue and it says sacrifice it, return target creature to its owner's hand. So essentially we can kind of pay ahead of time for this bounce spell. If we can get this down early, we don't have to save mana for a bounce spell to get our commander back to our hand. And then Aether Spellbomb is somewhat similar, though it does cost mana to actually bounce the creature. It's an artifact for 1 that costs a blue to sacrifice it to return target creature to its owner's hand, and by paying 1, we sacrifice it to draw a card. So this one does have some extra utility for us. Next up, we've got Void Stare, which is only a sorcery, but it can help us bounce any target non-land permanent back to its owner's hand. And then there's Boomerang, which is an instant for blue, and it says return target permanent to its owner's hand. So keep in mind this can bounce any permanent, including a land if you really need to. And then next up we've got Withdraw, which is an instant for blue that says return target creature to its owner's hand, then return another target creature to its owner's hand unless its controller pays 1. So essentially for all intents and purposes with this deck, this is bounce whatever creature an opponent controls, and then bounce our commander back to our hand. We target an opponent's creature with that first part, and then we target our own commander with that second part, and yeah, we're not going to pay that 1. But now let's talk about some bounce spells that have some extra utility with Into the Royal, Blink of an Eye, and Expel from Vraska. Into the Royal and Blink of an Eye are essentially the exact same card. They're both are going to return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand, and if this spell was kicked, we draw a card. And then Expel from Vraska says, return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. If you have the city's blessing, you may put that permanent on top of its owner's library instead. In Commander, it's very easy for us to get the city's blessing, so yeah, we've got some options with this when we cast it. Next up, there's Depart the Realm, which has foretell for just a blue, and it says return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. So we can foretell this early to save some mana on it later, and actually to, throw off our opponents as to what this card might be. And then there's Echoing Truth, which is an instant for 1 and a blue, and it says return target non-land permanent and all their permanents with the same name as that permanent to their owner's hands. So obviously we can use this, like all of these other spells, to bounce our commander back to our hand. And in Commander, typically there aren't going to be 2 cards that have the exact same name in play, except for tokens if we're playing against a token strategy. So yeah, this can basically just wipe out a ton of tokens if they all share the same name. And then Unsubstantiate has some extra utility as well. It says return target spell or creature to its owner's hand. So by bouncing a spell back to its owner's hand, it's kind of like a delay effect, and basically our opponent just wasted mana to do nothing. And then because of that, they might not have enough mana to actually cast the spell again. Now while this doesn't fully counter a spell, it can save us in a lot of situations, but of course we're also running some actual counter spells with Saw It Coming, Negate, and Foil. Saw It Coming has foretell for 1 and a blue, and it says counter target spell. And then Negate can counter any target non-creature spell, which is generally the type of spell that we're going to want to counter. Foil says you may discard an island card and another card rather than pay the spell's mana cost, counter target spell. So this is basically a free counter spell for this deck's purposes, and this can come in really huge in a lot of situations. And speaking of coming in huge, we also have some larger bounce spells with Brawl's Expertise and Aether Gale. Brawl's Expertise says return up to 3 target artifacts and or creatures to the owner's hands. You may cast a card with converted mana cost 4 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. So this can bounce some things that we don't want on the field, on top of letting us cast another spell for free. And then finally Aether Gale says return 6 target non-land permanents to their owner's hands. So we can temporarily get rid of a lot of pesky things on the board and set our opponents back. Now obviously with all these bounce spells, that is one way to get that divinity counter on our commander by bouncing it back to our hand and recasting it. And although that can take some time and a lot of resources to do, the payoff can be incredible. But there's actually a sneaky way around having to recast our commander. So in this deck, we're going to be utilizing clones like, well, Clone. Clone is a 0/0 shapeshifter that says you may have Clone enter the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield. So if we get Myojin of Seeing Winds in play, and we cast Clone making a copy of it, we basically get around having to bounce it back to our hand and recasting it. Clone is going to enter the battlefield as an exact copy of Myojin of Seeing Winds, and because we cast it from our hand, we're going to get that divinity counter on it. Now unfortunately to do this, we're going to lose the original Myojin of Seeing Winds because of the legendary rule. But our commander did its job in helping us get that divinity counter, which again is the first step to really set ourselves up for success. So we're also going to be utilizing other clones like Mirror Image and Vizier of Many Faces. Mirror Image is essentially a cheaper version of Clone, but can only copy a creature that we control, which again is completely fine because again we just want to make sure it's a copy of our commander. And then Vizier of Many Faces is a clone that we can actually get back because it has Embalm. So if we need to utilize it twice, we can. We can also utilize other clones like Wall of Stolen Identity, Vesuvian Shapeshifter, and Mercurial Pretender. Wall of Stolen Identity is going to enter the battlefield as a copy of any creature on the battlefield except it's a wallness to its other types and has Defender. When we do, we tap down the creature and it doesn't untap during the controller's untap step for as long as we control Wall of Stolen Identity. So if we really need to, we can shut an opponent's creature down with this, but again, if we're going to be using it on our commander, it doesn't really matter that it taps it down because our commander just is going to die anyways. And the Vesuvian Shapeshifter is a clone that can work with Morph, which I guess can come in handy, but really we're just going to be utilizing it as a clone, and Mercurial Pretender can also bounce back to our hand if we really need to by paying 2 blue. And actually the bouncing and changing of these clones can come in handy if we actually are making it into a copy of our opponent's creatures if we really need to earlier on in the game. Because again, we can still utilize a bounce ability or a bounce spell to actually get them back to our hand to use them on our commander as well. So in a way, we can kind of reset clones. So to do that, we can also utilize cards like Crystal Shard and Portal of Sanctuary. Crystal Shard has pay 3 and tap it to add a blue, or return target creature to its owner's hand unless its controller pays 1. Obviously, we're not going to pay that 1, and keep in mind that we can also utilize this to bounce our commander back to our hand too. And then in a similar way, there's Portal of Sanctuary, which we just have to pay 1 and tap it to bounce a creature we control back to our hand, but we can only activate its ability during our turn, but again, that's still going to be really effective in this deck. And then Trusted Advisor can help us out in a different way. It says your maximum hand size is increased by 2, and at the beginning of your upkeep, return a blue creature you control to its owner's hand. So increasing our hand size is pretty much never a bad thing, and again, a repeatable bounce effect like this one can really help this deck out. But after we've either gotten a clone out with a divinity counter on it, or our commander back out with a divinity counter on it, that's when things get really fun. because then we can utilize some proliferate effects like Contentious Plan, Steady Progress, and Tezzeret's Gambit. Contentious Plan says proliferate, draw a card. Proliferating means that we choose any number of permanents and/or players, then give each another counter of each kind already there. Basically, hey, you see that divinity counter? Now we get an extra one of those. And keep in mind, by proliferating, we can also get more charge counters on those artifacts that I talked about earlier. But again, getting an extra divinity counter on our commander is exactly what we need to get things going, because by doing that, we can safely take one off. Again, not only is our commander indestructible when it has one on, so it's important in that reason to keep one on, but also, yeah, we want to have something to proliferate as well. So by having 2 counters on it, we can remove 1 and draw an absurd amount of cards. Again, our commander draws us a card for each permanent we control, and we've got a ton of ways to ramp in this deck, so we're going to be getting a lot of mana rocks out in play and flooding the field with those. So by drawing an incredible amount of cards, we can draw into more proliferate cards like maybe Steady Progress or Tezzeret's Gambit, and then cast those to get another counter on. Steady Progress is going to proliferate and then draw a card, and then Tezzeret's Gambit says draw 2 cards, then proliferate. And even if we don't draw into a proliferate card, if we draw into another clone, we can utilize that too. We can remove the last divinity counter from the Myojin that's in play, and then yeah, draw a ton of cards again, and then clone it, so we get one in play again that has the divinity counter on it. So yeah, the goal is basically to just keep getting more and more divinity counters on our commander to churn through our deck in absolutely no time. And some cards that can repeatedly help with this are cards like Guildpact Informant and Thrumming Bird. Guildpact Informant says when it deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, proliferate, and it's got flying, so it can get through usually on at least one player. And then Thrumming Bird is very similar. It says whenever it deals combat damage to a player, proliferate, and it's got flying. So yeah, most of the time, simply by attacking with one of these, we're going to get some damage through, and we're going to proliferate for our commander. But as effective as these are, there's one card in this deck that clearly stands above all the rest. And that would be the golden pig of this deck, which is the number 1 card out of our 99. And the golden pig for this deck is Flux Channeler. Flux Channeler is a 2/2 human wizard for 2 and a blue, and it says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, proliferate. This deck is running an absurd amount of non-creature spells and a lot of really cheap non-creature spells. So once we have that 1 divinity counter on our commander, with this in play, we're basically unstoppable and we're going to churn through our deck in no time. We simply cast a cheap non-creature spell, maybe one of those bounce spells to bounce one of our opponent's creatures, and then yeah, we proliferate. So then we can take that 2nd divinity counter off our commander, draw an absurd amount of cards, probably some more non-creature spells, and yeah, cast another one and then do the same. This card has so much potential in this deck, and again, remember, if we draw into something like Dramatic Reversal, our opponents basically have no chance. We cast that non-creature spell, we proliferate, and then we untap all non-land permanents, which again, we're going to have a ton of mana rocks for even more mana, so yeah, winning in that one turn is going to be very easy for us. This card is absolutely incredible in this deck and definitely deserves the title of the Golden Pig. And then next up, we've also got 2 more repeatable proliferate effects that can be very impactful with Contagion Clasp and Throne of Geth. When Contagion Clasp enters the battlefield, we put a -1/-1 counter on target creature, and by paying 4 and tapping it, we proliferate. While that -1/-1 counter is nice, the important part here is that proliferating. And 4 mana to essentially guarantee that we can draw an absurd amount of cards is, yeah, going to be well worth it. And so is Throne of Geth, which has tap, sacrifice, an artifact, proliferate. So in a pinch, if we need to, we can just play this, tap and sacrifice itself to proliferate. So yeah, 2 mana to proliferate, that's fantastic. But also, if we have enough mana rocks in play or other artifacts in play, we can utilize them to keep proliferating over and over again. Again, once we're set up, we can do some really powerful and incredible things with this deck. And speaking of incredible things, we have got to talk about Teferi's Ageless Insight and Thought Reflection and their impact in this deck. Teferi's Ageless Insight is a legendary enchantment that says if you would draw a card except the first one you draw on each of your draw steps, draw 2 cards instead. And then Thought Reflection is somewhat similar. It says if you would draw a card, draw 2 cards instead, so yeah, no restriction on that first one you draw. Regardless, each of these essentially have the exact same function in this deck. They double up the amount of cards that we're going to be drawing with our commander's divinity counters. Again, with those divinity counters, we're easily going to be drawing 10 plus cards on each go. These double that up, and yeah, let us draw through our deck in absolutely no time. So they help us churn through our deck quicker and essentially help ensure that we can hit another way to proliferate to get another counter on our commander. Now, one thing they can also help us hit are cards that help us not lose the game by drawing ourselves out. So cards like Elixir of Immortality, Midnight Clock, and Temporal Cascade can come in really huge. Elixir of Immortality is an artifact that costs 1, and by paying 2 and tapping it, we gain 5 life and we shuffle it in our graveyard into their owner's library. So this is a repeatable way to not mill ourselves, essentially. And then Midnight Clock is a fantastic mana rock in this deck. It's an artifact for 2 and a blue that has tap blue. By paying 2 and a blue, we put an hour counter on it, and at the beginning of each upkeep, we put an hour counter on Midnight Clock. When the 12th hour counter is put on Midnight Clock, we shuffle our hand and graveyard into our library, then draw 7 cards, and we exile Midnight Clock. So this can help us early on in the game as a mana rock, and later on in the game, this can help prevent us from milling ourselves. And then Temporal Cascade can help us out in multiple ways. It says choose one, each player shuffles their hand and graveyard into their library, or each player draws 7 cards, and it's got Entwine for 2 if we want both. Now, actually, most of the time for this deck's purposes, we're just going to be choosing that first one. First off, we don't want to mill ourselves, so yeah, shuffling our hand and graveyard into our library can prevent us from doing that. But what that also does is shuts our opponents down. So when we do that, no one has a hand. Yes, including ourselves, but that really doesn't matter again with this commander because our commander can just replace our hand immediately. I mean, replace our hand and then some because again, yeah, our commander is going to be drawing us an absurd amount of cards. So this is a fantastic way to make sure that we don't mill, and it protects ourselves by getting rid of our opponent's hands. So good luck stopping us when we leave our opponent's handless when we can just refill in absolutely no time. Now at this point, you might be thinking, well, all this is great, but how are we actually going to win? And you might also be thinking, well, why would we actually want to shuffle our things back into our library if we can just use something like the Lab Maniac to win by, drawing ourselves out? And the answer is actually, I personally just really don't like the Lab Maniac and Thassa's Oracle and, Jace win like that. I just don't, okay? I'm completely fine with others playing it, but even in a deck like this, I just find that win condition a bit too easy. That being said, obviously if you want to utilize those cards as win conditions for this deck, you can. So yeah, just replace some cards in the deck and use those to win. But for my deck, I'm going to be finishing my opponents off with cards like Ominous Seas and Psychosis Crawler. Ominous Seas is an enchantment that says, whenever you draw a card, put a foreshadow counter on Ominous Seas. By removing 8 foreshadow counters on it, you create an 8/8 blue Kraken creature token. And on top of that, it's got cycling for 2 in case you need to get rid of it for something else. Regardless, if we are utilizing this card to win, obviously we can make an absurd amount of Krakens because we're going to be drawing through our deck and then some most of the time. So we can just hold a bunch of foreshadow counters on it, and then right before our turn, get rid of all those counters, make a ton of Krakens, and then swing at our opponents and kill them. And speaking of taking out our opponents, Psychosis Crawler can really help us out with that as well. It's a star with power and toughness equal to the number of cards in our hand, and it says whenever you draw a card, each opponent loses 1 life. Once we're set up properly, drawing 40 cards in a single turn can be easily attainable in this deck. And even if one of our opponents doesn't get drained out, we can utilize our bounce spells to get rid of their things in play, and then swing through the Psychosis Crawler, which is going to be huge. But the other way for us to take out our opponents is with mill, with things like Psychic Corrosion and Mystic Redaction. Psychic Corrosion is an enchantment for 2 and a blue, and it says whenever you draw a card, each opponent puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard. So yeah, for every single card we draw, we mill each opponent by 2, and yeah, we're going to be drawing an absurd amount of cards in a single turn, and we can easily mill them out. And then Mystic Redaction is kind of the other end of this. It says at the beginning of your upkeep, scry 1, and whenever you discard a card, each opponent mills 2 cards. So yeah, we basically just draw a ton of cards, go to our end step, and yeah, we have to discard down to maximum hand size. So unfortunately, we've got to discard a ton of cards, and we mill our opponents out. Regardless, again, this deck can win in a lot of big and splashy ways, and if you want to, win with that Lab Maniac kind of strategy, you definitely can. But now that we've talked about the non-land cards in this deck, let's quickly go through the lands, and there's actually one that can be incredibly impactful in this deck. And that would be Command Beacon. Command Beacon is a land that taps for a colorless, and we can tap and sacrifice it to put our commander into our hand from the command zone. This essentially gets around our commander's biggest weakness, which again is basically that if we cast it from our command zone, we don't get that divinity counter. So in a way, this land kind of skips a step by saying, okay, I'll sacrifice this one land to basically not have to cast my commander from the command zone and then get it back to my hand and then recast it. That is well worth just sacrificing this one land to just make our commander essentially work like, most commanders do. Regardless, we're also going to be running Myriad Landscape, which doesn't help us out nearly as much, but it can still help us out by ramping us. It enters the battlefield tapped, and it can tap dead a colorless, and we can pay 2 and tap and sacrifice it to search our library for the 2 basic land cards that Cherry Land type, put them on the battlefield tap, then shuffle. Basically, sacrifice it, go get 2 islands. And speaking of islands, the rest of our mana base is very simple with 34 islands. But now that we've talked about every single card in this deck, including the lands, let's talk about the price. Now, I try to keep this deck as budget as possible while utilizing some incredibly impactful cards in it like Psychic Corrosion and Command Beacon, but yeah, overall the estimated cost is still under $50. And keep in mind that that price isn't a fully optimized price. It's not taking into account heavily played or damaged cards, which always need a home too. It also is counting every single basic land with those islands at 10 cents a piece, so that's an extra $3.40 to take off too. If you have those basic lands already, I should say. Regardless, keep in mind that this also doesn't include shipping, and again with your location, that might vary depending on where you're at. Overall though, I was really happy with the way that this stack turned out. But again, at the end of the day, you've got to let me know, and please do in the comments, is this deck genius or absolutely crazy? If you're looking to play this deck, consider joining the amazing PlayEDH Discord. It's a great way to play Commander over webcam. In the description below, you'll find their Discord invite link as well as the tier that this deck has been approved at next to the deck list. So if you want to pick it up and play it as is, you can, and be sure to read their welcome information for more details. And with that, the show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.